Thank you very much. I've been here so many times I've lost count. I can never turn down Judith. She is an extraordinarily persuasive person. Plus, she always takes me to great places for dinner. So how could I possibly refuse? It's good to see so many people that I have seen over the years. I hope I don't say exactly the same thing I've said every other time, but it'll be close. And that's because my focus, as implied by the introduction, has always been that institutions matter, and that the performance of an economy, whether you want to look at it from the standpoint of the entire economy, or you want to look at it from the standpoint of particular important sectors, is strongly influenced by the governance institutions. Although many people like to advocate the presence of a market-driven economy, what they call the free market, the reality is the legal system, the system of property rights, the system of liability law, and the system of regulatory law and business law are essential features of any modern economy, and indeed a totally anarchic, ruleless society would not be one in which people would be willing to make long-term financial investments, build long-lived capital assets, engage in long-term contracts. So the governance institutions of the country are essential. And in my topic that I was given, which is pretty much the same topic I've been given every time I've been here, is priorities. And the priorities are going to be, in the end, governance. But the choice of governance institutions is driven by expectations of the future and where you want to go in terms of performance. And that's why the previous talk, actually the change in the order of speakers is actually better for my purposes, because I can just reference them rather than going into, I'm going to shorten my talk because in reality the last two speakers have covered a significant fraction of what I was going to say. So I want to start out with, where is Mexico today? Now, there has been enormous progress in telecommunications in Mexico in the last decade. There's no arguing the fact that things are better. And indeed, policy changes in the last few years have enhanced the performance of the telecommunications system. Just briefly to go over some of the things that have happened in the last few years is the mostly successful, not completely successful, spectrum auction, most recent spectrum auction. The dominance finding, which got the terminating access call right, and I might add, Mexico ranks among a minority of countries in the world that have gotten the terminating access problem correct, which is that in a world in which companies charge for termination, termination is a monopoly. That is to say, you always are attempting to terminate with a specific person. And once a company has that person as a subscriber, and that subscriber bears no financial cost or termination, then the carrier becomes the monopoly supplier of access to connect with that subscriber. Now, the number of countries that have had an authority like the Competition Commission actually come out, not only in find dominance, but get the analytics right. There's about 20 in the entire world. So you should be proud of the Competition Commission of getting that one right. Many people have not gotten it right, including some pretty famous economists who work as consultants for telecom companies. And so that deserves a gold star, getting the termination problem right. It's very recent, so we'll see if the policy implication of it is gotten right, and I'm going to get to that. Also, the slide that was presented, I forget now who presented it, about what's happening to the termination access prices in general. They're dropping rapidly. And that's terrific. That's really good news. They're still only about 10 to 100 times above cost. but that's still very good news, all right? That they're coming down, and they ought to be coming down. And that's really good, because we're going to get to something about the fundamental about the technology and the cost of the telecommunications network that's extremely important for future policy, and getting these usage-based charges down is an extremely important component of rationalization of regulatory structure. Finally, we had the mostly, but not completely, but mostly successful CFE auction for the fiber network. And that, again, brings substantial new capacity into the system that does hold the promise and is beginning to hold the reality of a substantial improvement in performance. Now, having said this, we can't feel too happy. And the reason we can't feel too happy is in Raul's paper, which is, if you unpack the 6,722,000 data points in that paper, what it's really about is how rapidly things are changing everywhere, and how rapid technological progress in telecommunications is and has been for the last 2 decades. That you have to run very fast to stay in place in your relative rankings among the world. And now we all have our favorite list of what are Mexico's peer group countries, and I have created mine as well. And I'm just going to read you who they are. I'm not going to give you another lecture about where you stand among the peers, except to a few examples. So my list consists of all the countries who have purchasing power parity per capita GDP between $7,500 and $15,000. All right, and who have a population of more than 10 million. Because there's a certain minimum level of population you need in order to have a competitive telecommunication industry, even modestly competitive telecommunication industry. So according to those criteria, the income criteria and the population criteria, the peer group consists of Algeria, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Cuba. Most people don't put Cuba in the comparison group. I saw that Raul did, and that's good. Ecuador, Iran, if you get that one. Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Peru, Romania, South Africa, Tunisia, Turkey, and Venezuela. Now, the really good news here, that's the Bill Clinton story. I was going to tell the Bill Clinton story too, so it's great minds think alike, I guess. That Mexico will always have Cuba, in the sense that the penetration of wireless services in Cuba is extremely limited. And that's because getting a wireless telephone or a wireline telephone in Cuba is partly a political act as well as an economic act. But I warn you, you shouldn't feel too comfortable, because since Raul has replaced Fidel, penetration of telecommunications in Cuba has increased by a factor of 5. In other words, Raul is breathing down your neck. Now, it's still going to be a decade before Cuba catches up to Mexico, but they're growing like a weed. They have undertaken, it's sort of off the radar screen, but they have undertaken a series of policy reforms, not only in telecommunications, but in the rest of the economy, that they're no longer going to be enormous sleeping giant. They're waking up. So you have to worry about, Arkansas had Mississippi, you had Cuba, you've got to worry about this. Cuba's going. So the next best thing you can talk about is the Ayatollahs. You're still way ahead of Iran, and nothing's happening there. It's not improving. So you can always say, well, if you don't like it here, move to Iran. So I will spare you any more talk about the details. But there are a number of people who have attempted to create these various indexes of how advanced the telecommunications system is in various parts of the country, various parts of the world. And there are, the problem, of course, is its many, many dimensions of performance. And collapsing them all to a single index, as Rome said, is a somewhat arbitrary process, and you're always going to have arguments at the margin about whether the way you constructed some sort of an index really is right or not, whether it's got biases in it or not, whatever. But the point is, it doesn't really matter very much how you do this. You keep coming up with the same answer. And the answer is that other countries are improving more rapidly than Mexico on average. That the institution, and the reason for it is institutional reform, governance reform. It's not that there's something intrinsic about, say, Brazilians and Colombians. Finally, in the last 10 years, they've figured it out. They're not sort of inherently situated to do things better. It's they have undertaken governance reforms that have fixed some of their principal barriers to progress in telecommunications. And that is the lesson of looking at these relative comparative figures, is that there are certain things one can do, which we might call best practice policy. I don't like that nomenclature because there isn't any best practice policy anywhere in the world. Nobody gets everything right. But there's better and there's worse. And the movement in the world in general is towards better policy. So Mexico can improve, but if it doesn't improve rapidly, it'll continue to fall behind because others are improving rapidly. I would say priority number one, which I would recommend for the new administration, is the creation, for the first time, an institutionalization of learning from others. It would only take a couple of people, and indeed at CIDE you've got people with all the data anyway and all the connections anyway, you can just piggyback off them. Institutionalized learning from the experiments of others. Latin America in particular, roughly half of the countries in Latin America are experimenting with changes in policy. They are constantly changing what they're doing. And watching what they do and seeing how it works and comparing their performance before and after changes with performance in Mexico strikes me as an eminently good idea. There's no point in all 40 or so countries in Latin America inventing best practice policy all by themselves. Collaboration is useful. Indeed, around the world now, in various regions, there are things being invented called regional or multinational regulatory authorities. That is, they're not really authorities because they don't actually make rules. Although a couple of them have been designated by little tiny countries as their official regulator. But what they are is entities where people from regulatory institutions within a region adopt best practice, harmonized rules, approaches to do regulation, approaches to do telecommunications policy, and that are based upon their mutual experience and borrowing from each other as a formal institutional entity. And so I would think that's a good idea for Latin America. You already have institutions in place in Latin America that could be the vehicle for this. You don't have to reinvent the entire institution structure. You just have to have this as a component. And that, it would seem to me, that would be extremely beneficial in two ways. It would, first of all, just from the standpoint of a large country like Mexico, it would be extremely useful to be able to know more about what's going on in other countries and how the very same companies that operate in Mexico operate differently elsewhere because the rules are different. That's a really useful thing to say because it can't possibly be right that the people who run these companies suddenly transform their personalities and their objectives and their business acumen when they cross a border. If the performance of these countries is different in these same companies is different in different institutional contexts, it's because of the policy. And that's a useful thing to understand and study. Okay, so that's the point of, I think, thinking about Mexico's policy. Oh, I wanted one other point. The other advantage of this harmonization is it really does let you get along better with small neighbors. That Mexico, is to the rest of Central America as sort of the U.S. is to Mexico. You're always worried about us as sort of overwhelming you economically. Well, likewise, you overwhelm the people in the South. And there's a lot to be gained from harmonization of regulatory institutions across those countries. And that would be especially beneficial to the small countries in Central America. But it would also be beneficial, it seems to me, to Mexico as part of the regional market. Okay, so that's point one on the priority list.